During the Industrial Revolution, poor children often worked full-time jobs in order to help support their families. Children as young as 4 years old worked long hours in factories under dangerous conditions. The practice of children labor continued throughout much of the Industrial Revolution until laws were eventually passed that made child labor illegal. The rise of child labor in the U.S. began in the late 1700s and early 1800s. When the Industrial Revolution started, many families had to find someone to work or they wouldn't survive. When European immigrants came, they weren't strangers to hard work. When the Industrial Revolution first came to Britain and the US, there was a high demand for labor. Families quickly migrated from the rural farm areas to the newly industrialized cities to find work. This led to high rise in child labor in factories. The Industrial Revolution was a time of few government regulations on working conditions and hours. Children often had to work under very dangerous conditions. They lost limbs or fingers working on high-powered machinery with little training. They worked in mines with bad ventilation and developed lung diseases. Children performed all sorts of jobs, including working on machines in factories, selling newspapers on street corners, breaking up coal at the coal mines, and as chimney sweeps. Sometimes children were preferred to adults because they were small and could easily fit between machines and into small spaces. Another reason that businesses liked to hire children workers was because they worked for low pay. In many cases, children were paid at all but workers for their room and board. When they did earn wages, children often earned 10 to 20% of what an adult would earn for the same job. In the US, a real effort to regulate and put an end to child labor began in the 1900s. Many businesses were against it because they liked the cheap labor. Some families also needed the money their kids brought home. However, eventually laws were passed. In 1930, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed that placed some limitations on child labor, set a minimum wage, and put limits on how many hours an employee should work.
In education instead. Reformers pointed to the horrible working conditions, the long hours, and the low wages that children received. In the 1840s, just as American reformers were having some success in limiting child working hours for native-born Americans, an influx of immigrants from places like Ireland provided a fresh supply of child labor for the burgeoning Industrial Revolution. Between 1902 and 1905, several organizations committed themselves to seeing an end to child labor in the United States. But it wasn't until the advent of the Great Depression that real change was on the horizon. With so many Americans out of work, labor unions and laborers began to clamor for an end to child labor to ensure that the adult working population would have enough jobs. This proved to be an important development. Lawmakers actually drafted legislation which ended the practice in the United States, limiting working hours and improving working conditions for young people. One of the lasting legacies of the battle to end the use of child labor is the importance of education. American reformers were able to make the case successfully that young people in a democracy needed to be educated in order to perform their civic duty.
To most of us, Labor Day means time off from work, maybe a barbecue to mark the official end of summer. But how much do you know about what inspired its creation? The labor movement. The labor movement started around the Industrial Revolution, a time in the late 19th century when America exploded in size and wealth. Advances in technology created manufacturing jobs, and people moved to cities to work in factories. But it wasn't the workers getting rich. It was their bosses who raked in big profits by paying low wages for long hours. Fed up with big business, industrial workers created unions to fight for better conditions. Unions are the backbone of the labor movement, but what exactly did they accomplish? Well, for one, you can thank the labor movement for your work-free weekend. In the late 1800s, the average American worked as much as 100 hours a week. Unions held strikes to demand shorter work weeks and an 8-hour workday to make time for family and relaxation. The most famous strike, the Haymarket Riots, happened in Chicago on May 1st, 1886, with thousands of people taking to the streets, and their voices only grew louder from there. The labor movement also protested child labor. Remember those black and white photos of children with dirty, sad faces wearing overalls and beanie caps? Those kids weren't playing outside, but they were working in factories. In 1881, unions demanded that businesses stop hiring kids under 14. and slowly but surely, measures against child labor caught on around the country. Eventually, all those protests got results. In 1938, Congress passed a law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set the 40-hour work week, regulated child labor, and set standards for minimum wage and overtime pay. In the 1930s and 1940s, workers were also able to negotiate health benefit plans from their employers. Though union membership is on a decline today, it's undeniable that the labor movement forever changed the way Americans live, work, and even relax.